to make such great content still available. So we will be videoing all of these, and we have for the last, I think, 3 or 4 at least. But I've been really looking forward to this presentation because I actually had art history as my major in college, but I never got to do anything with it till I got to be here. And so it's a topic near and dear to my heart. And I think Ruth has just the most interesting perspective. So I'm going to let Ruth kind of introduce herself and what her background is and why she's the person to do this presentation. But I want to thank her. I know it's a lot of work to put together a presentation, and she had to travel from Paonia, Hotchkiss. Yeah, and so, you know, we appreciate people. We have so much talent in this area, and part of what Voices of the Western Slope is designed to do is to showcase some of the knowledge and expertise we have, and we're privileged to do that in conjunction with the Delta County Library System. So you don't need to listen to me. This is a by donation event, and we thank you all for your donation. And without further ado, Ruth Pettigrew.
Hi. Well, thanks for that nice introduction, Deb. And I did teach for quite a long while, but what I have planned for you tonight, I hope won't turn into an art history lecture. Stop me if it does. What I really wanted to talk about was more about us as viewers. And especially, you know, we were talking while Wayne was setting up my mic and all that stuff about how people have gotten more comfortable with maybe not coming out to events so much and so forth, and being videotaped. That made me nervous when I found that out last night. That was going to happen. But I'm actually on YouTube before this because I did do a very short thing on Harvest of Voices one time. So you never know where you're going to end up. Well, this slide I put on here to be a little bit provocative, and it also goes with the title, which people told me was a little bit provocative. Because they were, well, it was awkward, for one thing. I probably should have picked a different title. But I've been thinking about this a lot because I was reminiscing about my teaching years, and I was just telling Wayne at the beginning of the when I came in about John Powers. And he was a big collector of pop art, and he was influential in Colorado. And when he was in his later years, he came to give a great talk, which unfortunately we were unable to tape because he moved the lavalier mic and talked the other direction the whole time. And so all we got was sort of mumbling, rustling of his tie thing going on the whole time. But one of the things that he said after a lifetime of being a big collector of pop art was, people ask, you know, what should we collect? And he said, just buy what you love. Don't just buy because you're going to make it an investment. Don't buy it because you think it's an important artist. Buy it because you love it. Well, I've never really had a lot of money to buy art, but I've collected it mentally. And I think, you know, I was interested in art for a long time, but I really got a lot of exposure to it after I started teaching and traveling. So this slide is a little deceptive because I never met Andy Warhol. Sorry to disappoint you. He was on campus at Colorado State University, where I taught for 23 years, to sign his artwork, which is what he's doing up there. And I just love the perplexed look on his face, and he has a camera in his hand. It's like he's trying to record his own experience as an artist. And these cans had been removed from the front of the art building where I taught before I arrived in 1989 and put in storage because they were beginning to develop rust and they needed to be restored. And they have since been restored and they've been put back One sold to a Japanese buyer for some $165 million or something like that, which went immediately into helping the art building be refurbished. But I've never seen the other two. They're around somewhere, I guess. So anyway, you can buy it, but you can't own it. How do we appreciate art? And I intentionally picked art tonight that is probably not the kind of art that most of us would think of having in our living rooms in a frame. And before I get started, I wanted to especially express thanks for being invited to come here and speak. And so thank you to the Grand Mesa Arts and Entertainment Center, Deb Schaefer, and also the Delta County Public Library, LaDonna Gunn, Marianne Poche, and also much help from the tech staff and the librarians who helped me get a lot of materials in order to kind of refresh my memory and get this talk ready. I used to have a lot of art books, but when I moved over here from the Front Range, I got rid of them.
What were you doing?
Exactly. Well, they were big and heavy, you know, art books are. So anyway, a few of them got checked out from the library, and it was so great to just be able to look through them. They're beautiful. Well, going back to my own interest in art, I put this image up here of 2001: A Space Odyssey because many people start appreciating art at the entertainment level. They just want to go somewhere and be entertained. And I grew up in a household that had black and white TV. So on my 15th birthday, my dad took me and we went to the Boulder Theater and saw 2001, that was back in 1968, so now you know how old I am. And it was mind-boggling for me to see this movie in a cinematic theater. The color, the music, I was really mind-boggled by the music and the combination of all the visual and special effects that got put into it by Stanley Kubrick. And I had read the novel, the short novel by Arthur Clarke, so I knew what the story was about. I didn't need to pay attention to the plot. I just was taking it all in visually. So I became one of those individuals who stays to the bitter end of the movie and watches the credits and reads who did this. I mean, it takes a village of thousands of people to put together a movie like this. And I also got intrigued by some of the logos and like, you know, even if MGM did not produce this movie, they delivered it and distributed it. And this particular logo caught my eye because it had the lion, which is what most people will remember from it. But in the film strip above, it says Ars Gratia Artis. And of course, I didn't know Latin when I was, you know, a kid, but I looked it up and it means art for art's sake. And that impacted me because, you know, you think of art as something to decorate a room or something to invest in or whatever, but what about art just for art's sake? And I drew well when I was a kid. Mom brought home stacks of mimeograph paper for me to just draw on, because she didn't want me drawing on the walls. But getting interested in other artists, just I felt like it was a really mind-boggling and mind-expanding experience. Oops. Okay, another influence for me personally that takes me on up into my college years was Laurie Anderson. And I was attending the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley at the time, and I had a chance to go down and see her perform live. I love music. I played it in orchestras and stuff like that, so it really connected. I connected with her a lot because she did everything. She spoke meaningful messages, communicated well. That seems like a really good reason to make art. She performed music. She used all kinds of electronic devices like loopers and vocoders that alter your voice, and she put it all together on a video and live stage performance. So here she is in several different performance modes. Oh Superman, which was probably one of her iconic entrance into the avant-garde video world at the time, back in the 70s. Home of the Brave, Big Science, United States Part 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, here we are looking at stuff that you really can't collect. You can buy the albums. I have her LPs. You can play her music, and you can kind of reconstruct the live concert, but it's never quite the same as seeing a live performance of something like this. And one of the other things that I really respect about her is that she has had a lifetime of being in the arts. She was married to Lou Reed. She lived in New York for a while, and she just has always been doing this thing where she's pushing out this form of communication, visuals, and it's meaningful. It's not just thoughtless stuff. So she just released in 2015 a film that she produced herself called Heart of a Dog, and she reflects, I wouldn't say it's sentimental, but she reflects a lot about the death of her husband, Lou Reed, the death of her mother, and also the death of her little dear beloved dog, Lullabelle, which is featured in the movie. So it's just an arc that spans an entire lifetime, and I respect that a lot as a trait of creativity. So when you start looking at art from a different perspective of, well, I don't really want that in my living room, you don't need to go there. But you begin to learn things that teach you about yourself as well. When I was a student at UNC, I was in a seminar class on contemporary art, and I guess I thought art was painting and sculpting and stuff like that, you know, just your basic idea of making art. And so our professor, we were talking about contemporary art, like this kind of conceptual art that's created by Sol LeWitt. And we had about an hour discussion with other artists besides this, but of the same kind. And the professor asked us to go around the room and expound on something that we did not like. And I don't know, I didn't register that it might be a trick. So I just blurted out, I said, well, I think Sol LeWitt is really boring. I mean, what is there to look at, and what creativity is there in putting a bunch of cubes together? And so at the end, after we had gone around the circle and everybody had expressed what they didn't like, we were given the assignment to write a research paper on that very artist, of course. So, and one of the things that I want to express especially is that it really pays to go beyond the idea of just looking at something and saying, well, I don't like it, or, oh, I really like that. And that's sort of a dismissive gesture in both ways. So getting pulled into this research paper was profound for me, because I found out Sol LeWitt was definitely not boring and definitely had a lot of brilliant ideas. I did still like his wall drawings better than the cubes. And what I found out that was really interesting for Sol LeWitt is that he was disinvested in the idea of the artist having to do all the work to produce a work of art. I guess in my mind I sort of had this idea of the sweat quotient, you know. I worked really hard on this, and so it's a really great work of art. And what Sol LeWitt did in the books that I researched back in the 80s was that he was sort of analogized to being like a composer of music. He would write out instructions or sort of directions for other people to create his works of art. And oftentimes they involve line drawings, which sounds absurdly simple, but it's not. Determining the length and the point of origin and the point of termination for each line, as you can see in these installation walls. And over time, they accumulate, so it creates this complete drawing. And usually his works were completed by students. And so he disinvested himself from the idea of having to do all the work himself. And it was very liberating in terms of allowing himself to create permutation after permutation from these ideas that were generative. And so you get involved, I guess you could get involved in science and math and music to think of Sol-LeWitt and the way that he created his art. This is just an example of students drawing, practice drawing that they're going to do later for benefit drawing. And ironically, this was begun just in April of this year, but Sol-LeWitt died in 2007, so his ideas are still generative and carrying on. He did include color in some of his wall drawings, and it turns out that the titles are basically the description. Red, blue, and white crayon, black pencil grid on yellow wall. And many of these are in private collections. Some of them are in art museums and so forth. I think one of the works that I came to admire the most from Sol-LeWitt was a book, which probably now if you had the book, the published book, it was a limited edition, you'd have a fabulous work of art. Because every page had the directions, and then on the facing page had the executed work. And this one is described perfectly. Black circles, red grid, yellow arcs from 4 sides, and blue arcs from 4 corners. And it's just a page in a book, but it's so much more because it just starts your mind thinking about, for example, a musical composition. So I learned a lot from that one professor that made us write about what we hated. Okay, well, one of the things that I want to cover is basically why do we go to view art, whether it's in a gallery, like here at the Arts Center, or if we travel to see it. I've been fortunate to travel in my life, and some people even buy art and make a huge investment in it, like John Powers did. One of the things that I mentioned was to go beyond mere entertainment. I think a lot of people go to look at art because they want to feel inspired. They just want to have a refreshing thing to think about that's different from their own thoughts. Reflecting upon the meaning of your life. I do that a little bit too often, I think. Also, we go and view exhibits to invest in and encourage amazing local artists. I love to go see what a watercolorist is doing, or a sculptor is doing, someone that's carved something out of wood. Some people might enjoy going on a spiritual quest or a pilgrimage, even. There are still people that travel the entire pilgrimage road in Spain, the Santiago Road. And I think it takes like 3 months or something if you're going to go to all the churches on the site. And also gain meaning from, in our own lives, from looking at what other people have done. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting ourselves out the front door. And I have not experienced the Van Gogh immersive experience, but I've read some reviews online about it. And I think it might be one of those things where it just encourages people to go out and experience something new. Some people really liked it, some people didn't like it. What you get is, for between $60 and $90, you go into a big, huge warehouse-like structure or art museum, and they have reproductions of Vincent van Gogh's artwork in the scale that it's in. I mean, some of his paintings aren't really that big. What's missing is texture, but at least you kind of know what you're looking at. So it's a great introduction if you had kids along to, kind of introduce them to an artist that's so almost overpopular. Movies have been made about him and so forth. Then once you get into the immersive experience, you're surrounded by big, huge projections. And also, there's a little diorama room. You can see the kid sitting in the room, his room at Arles. And so you get a sense of his life. There are sounds as well, a narrative that kind of carries on with excerpts from his letters to his brother Theo. So I would say, try it. Maybe you'll like it, and maybe it'll just be one of those interesting experiences. One person commented that while she was sitting in the circle listening to the narrative, she got cold. I guess it'd be a good idea to take a sweater. Another immersive experience that's going around, quite popular right now, is the Wolf Meow installations, or Meow Wolf. I guess I have it backwards on the text. And that's a convergence of artists who do installation art that's constantly changing. I know there's been a convergence there in Denver. There's one in Santa Fe. It was started up. These things always take money to start up, and George R.R. Martin, if anybody's a fan of the Game of Thrones TV series, he's the author of those books, and he paid for a lot of that. Rolling Stone magazine reviewed it as a cool, mind-bending experience, and I read on one of their sort of overviews of their site that it's basically designed to inspire people to become creative. So it's kind of an inception point. And there are people inside the installation, they guide you. There's places where you can go in and play and move things around. So it's interactive. So if I ended up in a place where it was, sometime I might bother to go through just to see how it made me respond to it. There's just a couple more visuals of it. Well, another way that we maybe can approach viewing art without buying it, or buying it and, you know, not own it, because basically that phrase of my title is, there's more to it than owning something. It's, in fact, if you put your eye prints on something, you own it. So I'm not saying don't buy art, but I'm saying that it's bigger than that. Art history, doing a little bit of research, teaching our children about our heritage of the world and about different cultures and places in the world is a big part of what I got involved in for over 20 years at CSU, was just trying to show people some of the things that are now considered World Heritage Sites, and unfortunately they're also in danger because of the environment. The Lascaux Caves and the Chauvet Caves in France, you can't visit them. You can't go in. They're closed, and there's a good reason for that, because the condensation from human breath causes the calcite on the cave walls to just fall off. So instead of traveling and visiting these places, what can we do? And another one of the things that I love to do is research. And I found there was a beautiful book for this particular cave, the Chauvet Caves, which they were discovered not long ago, actually. A beautiful book published by the discoverers. They were spelunking when they found it. And it has beautiful photographs in it. And I don't know, I mean, it's just something I would love, if I ever got a chance, like with a National Geographic team or something, I would love to go, but chances of that are pretty slim. So prehistoric sites, things like Stonehenge. Is anybody here a Druid? They're opening it up on the equinox that's coming up next weekend, so that people who practice that religion can actually go to the Wiltshire site and go to Stonehenge. And one of the reasons I threw this in was because it is a symbolic or iconic image of what I call astroarchaeology, or if you want to turn it around, you can call it archaeoastronomy. Ancient people noticing the patterns of the stars, using the sun to date their calendar year, and even plant their harvest by that. And Stonehenge actually happens to be an astronomical calendar, as well as whatever else it was used for. At certain points in the time of the year, like the equinox or the solstices, the sun lines up with certain stones that have been placed into the ground. So they know that was at least one use for it. And the Egyptian tombs, again, another site that very difficult to travel to. Once you get there, it's going to be very crowded. If you get in there, you'll be kind of guided through and in and out because there's so many tourists, and maybe not anymore, but anyway, all of these sites have features that I would love to see in person, but I may never get to do that. So instead, I can do a lot of research and maintain a sense of wonder about these objects that were created by people, way back. My dad collected arrowheads before it was illegal. And one time when I was a little kid, he just put this tool in my hands, and it just made such an impression on me because I felt like I was holding the same tool that a person who lived hundreds of years ago had been holding or possibly even made. Here's a couple more examples, just quickly. I don't want to stall out on this, but have anybody ever traveled where they went to some of the large cathedrals in Europe? Did you get to stay in there a long time?
Most of them you could stay as long as you wanted. Some of them were tours, but you could just go and spend as much time as you wanted.
Yeah, just kind of wandering around. Did you happen to be in there when there was a concert going on? That's a really great, I mean, if you happen to be in the right place at the right time, that's a nice way to experience the acoustics. One of the things that you could investigate about something like this, and I really advise people to do research before they travel because it enhances your experience a lot. I stumbled across a book called The Power of Limits by Georgi Doksy, and I have a reference list if anybody's interested at the end. He talks about sacred geometry, and I don't really know anything about math, but basically different cultures, including the Greeks, came up with what they call sacred proportions. The Greeks came up with one called the golden rectangle. And the proportions are, side to length to height. And if you get it right, you've created something that harmonizes with the universe. Within that structure is the divine. And of course, these people who worked on Amiens Cathedral or Notre Dame of Chartres or in Paris were aware of these, and they used some of those so that the ultimate goal was to try to create every part of that building harmonizing together to create a sense of divine, even the stained glass windows and everything. So that's just another little something extra to know if you happen to be in those spaces, and if you can be there when a concert's happening, even better, because they designed the space so that the acoustics would be amazing. One place I'd like to go, I probably won't make it there, is some rock-cut caves in Elephanta, India. And Joseph Campbell describes this cave temple really well because he did a documentary series called The Power of Myth way back in I think it was in the 80s, 70s or 80s. And what happens is, because this is cut into deep caves, as you go in, your eyes don't see anything. And it takes a while for your eyes to adjust. We're seeing it illuminated for the photographic purposes, but imagine seeing this 15-foot high, serene sculpture of Shiva as Mahadeva, an embodiment of that particular god as combining the elements that are disparate or opposites and bringing them into harmony. And after a while of being in the dark, it just sort of emerges out of the dark in front of you massively. So that would be a nice effect to experience physically. Okay, this is an example of something that we could do with a work of art hanging in the gallery in there, or we could do it with something that we're, as tourists, just seeing for the first time. And that's what I call a case study on something. I did this one for my students because it was coming up right while I was still teaching in the 1990s. And it's the Arapacis altar in Rome. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. There's lots of information out there about this altar, but originally it was built during the Augustan period, and it was for worship and sacrifice of animals and things like that, which was part of the civic structure of Rome at the time. Beautiful relief sculptures, like this Gaia panel that's probably about as high as I am. Exquisite works of art. the building disappeared. It was completely disassembled, and it ended up in the foundations of another Roman building for a while. In the 1930s, it was re-excavated, and Mussolini decided that he was going to use it as part of his fascist regime in Italy. And so he had one of his architects build this really gloomy building to protect it, and they put it back together. It's an amazing story. So here comes the Arapachos again, like zoomed out of the ground. Originally, it was designed to be in a huge courtyard in the Augustan Palace area in Rome, and it was part of what's called an orologium, or a giant sundial. And there was an obelisk in the middle. Over there on the left, you can see a diagram of it, and the Arapachos was just a part of the sundial. So it was sort of like a way of telling when they needed to do their sacrifices and when they needed to pay their taxes and when they needed to go. It was sort of like going to church and going to the bank at the same time. And when you do these kind of case studies and read magazines about these particular artifacts or objects, you find out odd things. Like most of us, when we've gone to museums, you know, like in the British Museum where you see the Elgin marbles or whatever, they're white, pure white, and you just think, wow, how sublime. And I was actually almost disillusioned to find out that the Greeks and the Romans painted their sculpture. And I was like, well, that's kind of mind-blowing. I don't really like it that way. Because I first saw it all white. So it looks kind of garish to my eyes. But anyway, you find out these interesting things. Well, to end the case study, what you do is you find out everything you can about one object. And Richard Meyer, the architect of the Getty in Los Angeles, was awarded the design for a new structure to put this building in a better place where people could learn about its history. They got it all restored as much as possible. There are still some parts missing on the panels. And some of the Italians thought that his architecture was too modern for Rome, but it still won out. And it's in a very nice location where it's accessible, where people can go see it and try to understand it. Okay, we're moving on to another segment of what I wanted to talk about for art that you can buy, but you can't own it. And that's art that's temporary. It just exists in an environment for a very brief amount of time. I don't know if any of you were around when Christo and Jean-Claude did the Valley Curtain. Did you get to see it when it was up?
I didn't see it, I just read about it.
Okay. Yeah, because actually it was quite a project over in Rifle, and people were talking about it out on the golf course and everything. And it only got to be up for about a day because of the high winds that ripped through Rifle. But it's an interesting process to understand and think about these artists doing something like this. The Marin County project called The Running Fence was one of his most expansive projects. And it ran 24 miles across 2 counties and down into the ocean in California. Months and years of preparation and planning. And the way that they funded it was to create these beautiful, they're just luscious drawings with plans, site plans, and architectural, grids and things like that on it that make it look like a nice, something really interesting that got worked on a lot. Their signatures, of course, samples of the fabric that they wanted to use. So their plans and their proposals, and they were works of art that were frameable, tangible, that people could buy. And that's how they funded a huge project like this that would cost millions. They also had to go to town council meetings, go to private landowners and say, hey, could we run a fabric fence across your land? Guess how that would go over. And, oh, by the way, we promised to put everything back the way it was. Well, how many people believe that? But they really did it, and it cost millions. But the thing that really boggled most people's minds about it was that they were temporary. I mean, it took them almost 4 years to get the whole process going and the money raised and the fabrication of the running fence, and then it came down within 2 weeks. And I think they had to do a lot of, like pulling out the concrete plugs and stuff and restoring the land and putting it back. Some segments were taken away even sooner than that because people had livestock that needed to get through. So they had places, breaks in the fence, but it just was mind-boggling to people to think of something that was that big of a project that would only be up temporarily like that. So that's kind of what I'm driving at with my title. Even if you own one of those beautiful drawings, and they are beautiful renderings that have the idea going forward in it, there's just this sense of ephemerality. It's gone. You'll never see it on Earth again. They did all kinds of projects all around the world. They wrapped the Pont Neuf Bridge in Paris. They wrapped a bunch of islands off the coast of Florida. Those were spectacular if you could get up in a helicopter to see them. But again, they were only temporary because they didn't want to damage the environment. Another kind of temporary art that's sort of I call it hit and run art, was Jenny Holzer. And she uses words as her art form. There was an interesting movie that came out that I think was patterned after Jenny Holzer with, I can't remember the famous actress in it, but Jodie Foster. It was called Incognito, and the artist is famous for her word art, and that I won't give away the plot. You can watch it if you want. She gets chased around the country by Dennis Hopper, who's trying to kill her. So the interesting thing about Jenny Holzer's work is that she has inserted these words or phrases into an environment where you are not expecting to come across them. And it just catches you off guard. And to imagine, walking down a street in New York and having a truck drive by that says, "The truth is my subject." Or going out to Las Vegas where you're going to gamble and having a sign that says, "Protect me from what I want." Or being in an airport that says, "Money creates taste." So they kind of throw you sideways a little bit. And people have asked me, well, how would an artist like that sell their work? Well, she does. She makes posters, t-shirts, things like that, and framed works of art that are the truisms. So she's kind of an activist, I would say. She did do some installations in conventional sites like the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which has a huge spiral ramp that goes up. Frank Lloyd Wright designed that to be an atrium where people could kind of recover from seeing so much art. It's like a restful place to be. And she used the banisters around the spiral ramp to put her word art. And of course, one that we're all familiar with, which I think is powerful, is memorials. They're a public form of art. They have to go into a site where people are going to come together for ceremonies or for individual meditation. And Maya Lin was only 21, a student at Yale, when she designed the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I know they've had the replica of it come through a couple of times. And one of the things that's missing from that replica, even though I see people still having a profound experience with it, it's not as big, of course, as the original one. Maya Lin designed it to have polished granite walls. And so as you're looking at the names, you see yourself reflected in it, and that sense of mortality and connection to the people who died. She also designed the wall chronologically, so that the names go along chronologically rather than alphabetically. Imagine, the horror of finding your dear one's name in a list of similar names and having to hunt that out. So she put them chronologically, which made it very powerful. She was later awarded to do this memorial in Alabama for the Civil Rights Movement. And this one employs water, which is always very calming. And it runs across the table. It has the names of many of the people who were part of the Civil Rights Movement, and a quote behind that is from Martin Luther King. "Until justice rolls down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream." Okay, here's another little bit about archaeoastronomy. That's the way I call it. Nancy Holt created this amazing thing. This is another place where you'd have to go driving out in the desert in a Jeep and stay overnight just to see it. And so I don't think these artists were particularly motivated by money. They wanted to relate to the stars, they wanted to relate to the earth. And Holt is now dead, but I think that thing is still out there. And you can go out there and spend the night, and at certain times of year, the constellations line up. The reason I'm mentioning this is because many of the tribes in America, pre-Columbian tribes, already had some kind of calendar device, like not as massive as Stonehenge, but that charted the days and the progress of the sun. I included a couple of illustrations there. In Akiva, and also the sun dagger that's up on Chaco Canyon. Non-natives are not allowed to go up there because somebody vandalized it one time. This is leading up to, I guess I would call this artist the highlight of my talk, James Tyrell. And he basically uses light as a sculptural material. It's kind of a novel idea. What he has been quoted as saying is that he wants to help us see ourselves seeing. And so what he does is he creates these environments that are just flooded with light. He also has a lot of the characteristics of creativity that I admire, one of which is a sense of humor. It's hard to survive in the art world without it. He's very playful, but he also was raised as a Quaker, and so early on he had this sense of the idea, the Quaker idea when you're meditating is that you go inside to see the light. And so this particular installation that I'm showing in different phases of lightings is called The Light Inside. And so he's employing something that obviously has been on his mind since he was a kid. And he's now 78 and has done art installations all over the world. One of the ones that I thought had a sense of humor was Bridget's Bardot. Playing off the Tibetan idea of the netherworld where you just hang out if you die without becoming enlightened, you just go into a bardo. And that caught my attention. The idea is that your retina, the inside of your eye, is bathed in an entire environment of light. And so it illuminates you inside. And he's worked long and hard on this. One of his ideas that he's elaborated on is the use of an oculus that opens up to the sky on an interior structure. I think it'd be really cool to have one of these right next to a sauna. This one is in Järna, Sweden. And it changes. The light inside the dome changes as the light in the oculus, or the opening, changes as well. This isn't really a new idea. I mean, there's a building in Rome that has an oculus in the top of it. And, you know, that was built when they first invented concrete, for Pete's sake. So it's not a new idea, but it's being employed in a special way to use light. And one of the big impressive features that has been a lifelong passion for Tyrell is the Rodin Crater site out in Arizona. It's not even open to the public. Don't get excited yet, because if you wanted to go now, you'd have to pay about $7,000 and have a private viewing and stay out there for overnight. But it's planned to be open in 2023. Tyrell will be 80 by then. I hope he lives to see it open. What he's done is created the inside of an extinct volcanic crater into an astronomical device. It's huge. And the main feature that I happen to be looking at a Smithsonian magazine for May of this year, and it featured him, and it just really intrigued me. is to create a camera obscura that's so big that it pinholes the light into the volcanic structure inside. And so that's what this oculus does. You can see it in one view here, it looks circular, but as you get closer to it, it turns into a huge oval. And what it does is funnel the light inside into the volcano, which has been turned into an architectural structure, so that you can see a projection of the sky down on the floor. Let me get you to the next slide here. I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of a camera obscura, but I'll explain it briefly. Just a few views of his plan, his site drawings, and a satellite picture of the Roden crater site. So I really want to go out there. I want to, sometime after it opens and the prices go down, I want to go out there and see this. He's got a room in this. It's being well planned out. It's just not open yet. Here's the room that has all the drawings and maquettes of the volcano and stuff like that. Well, a camera obscura, in case you don't know, is basically, it just means, in Italian, it means dark room. And people discovered that even without a lens, if you make a little pinhole in a box, I think they've had a kids project at the libraries where you make a pinhole camera. It's just that they didn't have film back then, so the artist had to be in the room and draw an upside-down version of what was being projected into the room. Now with lenses, of course, they can flip it, but they know now that Vermeer used the camera obscura, and people often wondered why the optical kind of beauty of like portraits improved so much in the Renaissance and stuff. And David Hockney went into a great deal of detail in his book, Secret Knowledge, to reveal that people said, oh, well, that just means the artist didn't have any talent, they were cheating. Well, I mean, if you have a good tool and you use it, that's not cheating. So they were using the camera obscura, but it really changed the direction of European history, art history, at that time to a more optically perfect kind of art rather than the more expressive kind that you might expect to see during the medieval period. David Hockney himself, I admire also his qualities of creativity, which he's not afraid to investigate or explore. He's tried a lot of different things in his artistic career, collage, photography. As an older artist, he's gone into creating drawings on an iPad and just elaborating on landscapes and things like that. They're quite whimsical and playful. Okay, one last big artist, and then I'm going to just kind of taper off into some little details. I got to see Bill Viola's art, and again, this is stuff I don't think I really want to have one of these huge plasma screens in my home, but they're mesmerizing to look at in a gallery. And I went out to the Getty to a conference for visual resources back in 2002, I think it was, and they had these huge plasma screens that stand about 8 to 12 feet high. And what Bill Viola has done is taken film or video, actually, to the extreme of slow motion. If you're watching an animated movie, the frames go by your eye maybe about 24 frames per second. And he filmed things with such fast film that it was like 200 frames per second. That's the analogy. And then he slows it down. So the movements that you're seeing would be fairly rapid for normal viewing, but to watch it slow down is an interesting phenomenon, because what happens in the gallery, normally people just sort of browse by works of art. They just sort of walk by and glimpse and then walk to the next one. In works like this, it takes about a half hour for the movement, like the woman's arms, to come up to her face. It takes about a half hour. And you're just mesmerized. And what happens is the gallery viewers become self-conscious. They're sort of standing there going, wow, this is weird. I'm still standing here, it's a half hour later, instead of walking on through. So I found Bill Viola's art to be something I wouldn't really, I think it'd be kind of haunting to have a video feed on a plasma screen in your home. I don't think I'd want to do that. But in a gallery or some of the commercial settings where his work has appeared, it's really quite amazing. Okay, well, a few little last quips and bits about viewing art or appreciating art, if you will. Books. Undeniably, books are a fabulous, fabulous resource. And when I first moved here, I joined up with the little Hotchkiss book reading group, and one of the first books that we read was the Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. And so I was intrigued, and I really didn't know that much about this artist. So of course I was asked to, because I had the title of art person, I was asked to do the presentation for the library group. I looked him up, and he was a student of Rembrandt, Carol Fabritius. Anybody heard of him? He died young, he was in his 30s, and his studio was above an armory, and it blew up. So he was killed, and many, many of his works, which were probably masterpieces, were destroyed. This little tiny painting, which you can see the scale of it in the slide there, was one that survived. And I thought it was interesting that Donna Tartt chose it as a emblematic work for her book, because it's got this little bird that's chained to a perch. And in the book, her protagonist becomes tethered to this work of art because it's been stolen, and he's taking care of it, he thinks. So I won't give it away, but it's a great read. It won a Pulitzer Prize back in 2014. So it's well worth reading, and it focuses on this tiny little work of art. I found out so much about that. I had to look up Carol Fabritius, because in all my teaching days I'd never even heard of him. Ironic, isn't it? Another book that came along was the portrait of, it was called The Lady in Gold, The Extraordinary Tale of Gustav Klimt's Masterpiece, Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. And it was written by Anne Marie O'Connor. It was later turned into a film in 2015 called Woman in Gold. And this piece is also mentioned in a film called Monuments Men, if anybody saw that movie. The guys are actually rescuing, George Clooney, rescuing works of art from salt mines and caves and things where the Nazis had stowed them. And it's amazing that they didn't get blown up, because when the Nazis left Vienna, they pretty much decided if we can't have it, nobody can have it. So they blew up a lot of places too. So you learn a lot about the Vienna secessionist movement. You learn a lot about the Nazis coming into Vienna. I mean, they welcomed Hitler because he was born in Linz, which was not far from Vienna. So they were like, welcome, come back home. After I read this book and got to kind of learn a lot about this painting, I traveled to Vienna. And that was an exquisite experience. I got to go and see so many museums. There are over 80 museums in Vienna. Not all of them are art museums, and I picked about 5 in the time I was there. It was just overwhelming, the amount of art and music. The musical climate there is incredible. But I did get to go to an exhibit of Gustav Klimt's work in the Belvedere Palace, which has been turned into pretty much an art gallery. And I had a really odd experience there. This would be on the side of how not to experience art. They were featuring The Kiss, which is a famous painting by Klimt. It's probably one of his most famous paintings. They don't always have it out on exhibit. And so it was out, it was standing on an easel. And people could kind of walk by, and they had things around that said no pictures. But of course people were grabbing their cell phones and, taking pictures and stuff like that. And it's not as bad, the guards allow it because it's not a flash picture, which can damage some pigments and things on paintings. But I thought, well, here I am, I'll look at this painting. And so I was standing in front of it about 4 feet away from it, and this American tourist came and literally shoved me out of the way. And he said, I need to take a selfie of myself with this painting. So he shoved me out of the way, went like this, took a picture, and walked out of the room. He didn't even look at the painting. I thought, oh, what an age. But while I was, I did get to look at the painting eventually, but while I was sort of flustered by that experience, I walked around the corner and found another painting by Gustav Klimt called Judith and Holofernes, which is also thought to be a portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. So even though the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer that's in that movie and book isn't even in Vienna, and there's a whole big story of why that's true. I got to see something that was very similar in the style and gold overlay that was done by him that had a portrait of her. I found it amusing too because in art, if you're teaching art history, you end up seeing a whole bunch of paintings of the killing of Holofernes by Artemisia. And in some, Judith is the main feature, and she's slicing his head off. It's very dramatic, the Baroque painting of it. Another one is pretty much Judith is sort of sidelined by the horror of Holofernes' neck being slashed, and he's in the middle of the painting. And in this one, Klimt has basically relegated Holofernes' head to a tiny slice on the right-hand corner. She's just holding his hair. She's like, I'm done with this. So anyway, I got a lot of enjoyment out of seeing that painting just by accident that I didn't even know was in that gallery. And a beautiful array of landscapes by Klimt. I didn't even know he did landscapes. In fact, I have a grievance with most of the art history books I've ever taught from, which is that they pretty much skip over the whole Vienna scene. I don't know why they do that. I mean, we talk about the German expressionists and everything, but Vienna just gets overlooked a lot. Well, anyway, while I was there in Vienna, my friend and I that traveled together, maybe some of you know her, Georgia Finnegan, she and I got a day together to go to the Theater Museum. And it's a very small museum in Vienna. And I actually made the guards suspicious with what I was doing there because I'm not even that much of an admirer of Peter Paul Rubens. I've seen lots of his large paintings. And most of those big paintings, they might be as big as that wall there, were mostly executed by his students in an atelier or a workshop. He trained them how to paint draperies, how to paint landscape, how to paint horses, how to paint, little plants and stuff. And then he would come in at the end and do the finishing touches of the portraits and stuff like that. And he became almost kind of like a celebrity in the art world because he traveled to Italy, he got to see Michelangelo's paintings and sculptures. He really became kind of an entrepreneurial figure in the art world, and he realized that he could do these huge paintings that were portraits of royalty. But I always felt like there was something kind of commercial about his art. But when I walked into this room that had about 15 oil sketches that were only about this big, that had been executed completely in his hand, I was pulled in. And I spent so long in that room that the guards, they walk by and kind of cluck at me like, what are you doing still in this room? And so I spent quite a bit of time, and Georgia and I got a chance to look at, in the same museum, same exhibit and everything, Hieronymus Bosch's Last Judgment, which is a triptych painting, just like you're probably more familiar with if you've heard of Bosch, of his Garden of Earthly Delights. And it's full of these little dioramic scenes with possibly something hellish going on. Someone crucified across a harp with the harp strings piercing right through the body. Strange, monstrous creatures, people in little glass globes that have alchemical symbolism and so forth. It's just so complex that it's hard to look at. And this painting was the same. Georgia and I stood around and looked at it, and on the back are paintings on the back because it's a folding triptych. It's designed to close. And so we walked around behind it, and the guard came and was like, "What are you doing?" So we enjoyed it. We got to spend about a half hour looking at this painting and trying to understand some of the symbolism that went on. I first encountered Bosch in a psychedelic poster back in the 70s in a roommate's wall. It glowed in the dark and everything. And I didn't really know much about Bosch then, but I've come to appreciate him as kind of a prefigure of the Surrealist movement in the 30s. But he's from the 15th century, so he wasn't thinking surrealistically. He was trying to teach people good from evil. I ended up finding out a lot about Bosch from a book that I would really recommend. It's called Leap by Terry Tempest Williams, and she mostly writes about Utah and nature. But this was a kind of a sideline for her. She spent about 6 months in Spain, and so she decided to go to the Prado almost every day that she was able to go. And she meditated on Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, which is there at the Prado. And I just love that book because she basically does what I call ekphrasis. It's a Greek word that means to describe or explain so explicitly some object that you can see in your mind, you can see every detail. And so this book is basically an exercise in ekphrasis. And I have it, well, even the notes and the quotes from her, the end of her book, are well worth reading and getting involved in. Federico Garcia Lorca is quoted as talking about El Duende, which is basically the struggle inside that threatens to make art. And I think any creative soul can identify with that. I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, yeah, the ekphrasis thing, I decided to go ahead and turn into a game for you guys. We don't have to do it. Don't worry, we don't have to do it. Nothing embarrassing is going to happen. But I created a description of a work of art for someone who wanted it for insurance purposes. So I went through the exercise of ekphrasis. And while I was doing that, I thought, you know, this would make a really fun game. And so basically the rules of the game are you have yourself or you have a friendly adversary assign you, just like my professor did, some work of art that you don't know anything about or that you don't understand. And, or maybe you don't like it. And you have to find out everything you can about it. And then you go through a sort of classifying it. You know, what is it? Is it a painting? Is it a sculpture? Is it a building? Then you describe it completely. So you go through the ekphrasis process. Then you classify it. And finally, after going through all of those processes, you can offer your own opinion. And hopefully it'll be a little bit more of an educated opinion than you would have had other than just saying, I don't like it, like I did with Solomon. So over here I have examples of ekphrasis, the game. And so it goes through classifying, describing, explaining, and interpreting. And you can get points for depth of understanding, creative but accurate interpretation of a work of art, accuracy of history, best worded and most complete descriptions employing the most formal elements and art and compositional elements, and of course I've included those. You can find them in any art history text. Things like line, color, shape, stuff like that. Purposes for art. So it'll give you a review of maybe if you had to take one of those dreadful college humanities courses of art history. It'll bring back some really fond memories for you. I have one more slide that I'll just put up while we're chatting. Just suggestions and ideas about why we do what we do, and ways to appreciate art, even if you don't buy it or if you don't own it. So, thank you. Ray told me I better turn this off so that I wouldn't wander off into the bathroom or something.
Ruth, that was amazing. You want to know by the title exactly what she was going to talk about? And it was really, I want to do the, what do you call it?
Phrases?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I meant not tonight.
No, but
I don't think it's something you can do in 10 minutes.
here you go. Yeah, it's something that.
It's better than games at a beach show.
Yeah, it would be a good game.
Thank you.
People that are interested. So here's that.
Dale will play.
Okay.
I also have, I guess I'm just library oriented. My sources, in case anybody's interested. And also I've listed the images in case anybody's interested in looking at it. So,
Good. And if I need to make copies, I can make
yeah, I've got 11 here, but Deborah will make more in case we need. So, thanks for coming. I enjoyed this. I told one of the gals at the Hotchkiss Library, she said, well, how do you feel about speaking? And I said, well, I've been retired for 11 years now, and it's kind of like pulling that old Jeep out of the garage and seeing if it'll crank.
Well, it worked pretty well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I digressed a little bit there. I got a little art history-ish on you.
I
But
don't think so.
anyway, feel free to take these.
I enjoy it. One of the things I thought was really interesting is it